Hello and welcome. This is Cujo Sound WhiteNoiseTrash. I'm Bjørn Jacobsen and this here is my Unity series. Today I'm going to be showing a little bit of a tool that is always required for audio designers to use, and it's kind of easy to do in scripting, and it'll help you a lot, and it has always helped me. A bit of a backstory here is that in Unity projects, one of the problems that I have always experienced is that I need to explain things to coders. Not that coders are a problem and not that audio designers are bad at explaining things, but if I ask for something, they will usually just give me what I just asked for, and that's not necessarily what I wanted, which does say that I'm bad at explaining things. But let's say you have a character and you want footsteps, you want a trigger of a sound every time there is a footstep. They will usually just add a trigger when there is a footstep, and they will just put it into the character's game object, and you need to control it from there. And that's not always the best thing for an environment for audio designers to work in. Maybe you want more control and have sort of like a setup of where things can work. Also, you may want, let's say, especially for footsteps, you may want randomization. So the tool that we're going to build now will allow you to have always randomization of sounds, always like random pitch and a couple of other things. And it's really easy to use, but also you will be able to tell a programmer or a coder, whatever they want to be called, that whenever you need something, let's say in case of the footstep, if the footstep system is out of your control and that's something that they deal with, you can just simply tell the coder one line of code. I want this code to be fired whenever the footstep whenever the foot touches the ground. And then you can, on your own game object, the sound game object that we have created over there, we can then control our things, which means that we get sort of like a much more structured sound way of dealing with things. And we'll get to that. And I'll show you, because here I have loaded a different scene than before. This is a really nice landscape that I found in the asset store. It was also free. It's really cool. It has a lot of ambient sounds as well and so on. So it brings the whole thing more to life. Now, if we press play now, you will notice you can walk around. There'll be jump and footstep sounds, just like there was in the previous example with the ambient gates that we made. Here in the FPS controller, it actually does exactly what I don't want. And that is that it has a couple of scripts, it has an audio source, which means that everything is now in this one game object. I would prefer if my audio source and other things were outside of that one, so that I didn't have to worry about it. Because also in bigger productions, you may be in a situation where you can't alter this character because it's locked by someone else who's working on it. So you want to split it up. Now, check this out. They have an array here, a pool of footstep sounds, a jump, and a land sound. And those are in here. And that's a problem because we want them outside of the character. We would prefer to control this ourselves. Like maybe if you want pitch control on this, how do you explain that to a coder? Does the coder have time? Things like that. It's way faster and way more convenient if we can do this ourselves. So we are going to do so. I'm going to be creating a script that requires one line of code for something like this, and we can then use it in other places for whatever we want. And I'll show you. So we're going to be creating a new script. I'm going to create a new script here in our assets. Oh, not there. We're going to here create a new C# script. We're going to call it sound random controller. Inside this script, we're going to do a couple of things which I have no clue how really works, but I kind of understand how it works. It's I'll show you here. Up here, remember we had in some of the previous videos, we had this using a call that you can do up here, which kind of like loads a plugin that you can then use. That's what we want, because else other scripts can't necessarily understand what you're doing. So we're going to be creating a namespace, And this namespace, we're going to call it sound.randomController. And you don't need more than this. And the namespace requires a curly bracket, and it's going to end with a curly bracket down here. So now we have a namespace here, and which means that everything you're doing now is within this namespace. That means that now that we have established, the reason why we're going to call it sound.randomController is because I'm going to call every script that I do from now on, I'm going to call them sound dot and then whatever it does, which means that I can always now load them in other scripts without having to worry about other people suddenly using my scripts or suddenly using stuff that is linked to my stuff. So other scripts can just type using sound.randomController, or let's say we make a special trigger or something like that. That means that others in their tools will just be able to do that, and you can put this code in. That also makes the code much more efficient. It doesn't have to worry about everything in the code. It can just worry about whatever you just gave it. So we can here in our namespace, we can make a, I don't know what this bracket is called, an array. Anyway, we require component type of, and we say audio source. The reason why we do this is because already now, when you drag and drop this script onto a game object, it will automatically load that there should be an audio source there. You can see here, if we create an empty object here, so as you see here, once we drag and drop our sound random controller over here, it would automatically load an audio source, which is extremely convenient in case you, not necessarily just with an audio source, but if you need more than these, you can load these. Let's say you want to load an audio source and a rigid body and a couple of other things. You can always do it in this way by adding them to the script in here. So you simply give it a name, sound random controller, and you say this type, this namespace requires this component, and it will work. Okay, so for this to work, we would like some sort of array of sound files that we can play, because we're going to be considering jump sounds or footsteps as our primary problem here. So we're going to be creating a public, let's call it an audio clip array. We are going to call it sound files. By that, we create a list of audio clips of samples that we can add to the code, and we can just basically spam it. We can tell it we want 4 or 5 or just 1. It'll always work like that. And we're going to need some sort of source here. So we're going to say a private audio source, which is, we're just going to call it, because we can't call it the same thing, so we're going to call it sound emitter. Now, sound emitter is a word I use because when I was working on Hitman, we always called them emitters. We didn't call them sources. So I'm going to stick with calling it sound emitter. You can call it whatever you want if you're coding like this. That's basically, that's what we want to begin with. So down here, we need to establish in our start, this is what runs whenever the game starts to run. We need to establish which audio source is our sound emitter. So we can say sound emitter equals get component audio source. And it's going to be like this. That means that our sound emitter up here will become the component audio source is connected to this game object. You can also connect audio sources or whatever you want from other objects if that's what you want, which means that you can sort of cross-reference everything, and that's really cool and really useful to have. So let's move on here. So now we have established, if you look here in Unity, we now have this audio source here. We have explained our script that this is connected to it. You can see here we have sound files. We can easily say we want a pool of 4 files. You can drag and drop your clips onto here, and it works perfect. It's really easy to use. So let's go back and we'll just call this one here 0 to begin with. Yes. And what we can do is that we can always debug ourselves. Like I've explained before, you can type debug log and then tell it what to do. And we'll get back to that, but that's one of the best tools that you can ever use, is that you can simply just check, did something come in? And yes, and you can see it in the console of your Unity window over here, if something did come in, and the text that you wanted. And in that way you can track, is it playing the right file and so on, and we'll get to that as well. Another thing that we need to establish is that you can always create these voids here, which just do things for you. And let's do that. So private void, we have one called play sound clip. It takes no arguments. And of course it has its own set of curly brackets. Now, let's say play sound clip. If you just in here had some code that says do whatever, then in here you can now always say play sound clip like this, and it will do what's in this line of code, which is really useful, because then you can, in other places in the code, you can say, I want something to happen, and then when that is finished doing what it's doing, I want something to be triggered which does something completely different, which means that you can sort of order your things a little more. In our sound clip here, we are going to establish that it can randomize between the files that we have added. So we need some sort of randomization system, and we want an integer here to establish that we have a number, of course. So int n, you can call it a, sp, whatever. You can call it whatever you want, but it's just, it looks nice if it's n, and most code examples that you'll find online always uses I or n, or that's at least the numbers that I have seen. So n is a random range between 1 and sound files dot length. This means that we now have a number n, which is a random number between 1 and sound files, and the amount of sound files that we have. One thing that we need to notice in here is that when you have these components here, let's say you have 4, this is actually element 0 that won't be played. But we'll get to that. That actually means that we can have one of the sources prevented from being played, which we can use as a sort of a re-trigger prevention, which is really cool. So over here in our code, we have established that integer n is a random range, never bigger than the length, the amount of sound files that we have, and never smaller than 1. We could say 0, but we're going to use 1 because that serves the purpose that we need. So we need sound emitter clip. Sound emitter clip equals what? Sound files array number n. This means that the clip of our sound files emitter, or no, sound emitter here, this emitter will now have the clip that we have chosen, that the integer n has randomly chosen for us. So the next thing that we can do is that we can say sound emitter dot play one shot. It'll just play it once. And what should this sound emitter play one shot play? It's a little tricky, but it just needs to play the sound emitter dot clip. Else you could theoretically tell it specifically to play a specific file. We just wanted to play the file that it has just loaded. Now, here it's really important that we have a couple of comments to explain what is going on. So we can always do a 2 forward slashes like this and then type in what it does, because when you get back to this later, you may have no clue what this is. So this here establishes a random number between 1 and max size of audio clips. Yes. moves audio clip to audio source and plays it once. That's what this does. So now we know that, and we don't have to worry about it again, because once you get back to this, or if other people need to look at your code, they will be able to read what is actually going on. It might not be that tricky with this level of coding, but once you get really deep into code and you see code, if you need to ever look at coders' code, I look at it and I go, I have no clue what this is. So it's really important that comments are there, and it's really important because other people can then also read it. All right? Good. Once this has been established that we want this clip to play, we can do sound files n in the array, which we have, is now equal to sound files. You can then tell it specifically which value it has. 0. So that means that the file that we have just played is no longer whatever number it had before. It is now the value 0. This means that our integer here can no longer randomize between it. It will, though, if it moves another value, if it moves another clip to 0, it will just move it down the list. This means that we now actually have some sort of prevention system. So sound files 0 equals sound emitter dot clip. This establishes that the clip that we just played is moved to sound file 0. So sound file 0, no, n, is now forced to become 0. 0 forcibly gets the value of whatever clip is currently active, and in that way we prevent this from happening. So we can have, like, let's say 10 footsteps, and it will randomize between the 9 of them, except, well, it will randomize between the 10 of them, but it will never play the one called 0, so that the one that was just played, because we moved it to 0, will never play. Later, I'm going to add the option to do this and do not do this, so that we can sort of avoid it, but we'll get to that. One of the things that this is all about is that now we already have the ability to say that we have a random list of files and they will play. So we're going to be creating a public static void here. I have no idea what a public static void is. I just know how it works. So if you're a programmer, can explain it in the comments, please do. Public static void, we're going to call it trigger. This means that we can now type trigger outside of this code, and it will launch this method, this void that we have here. So what happens inside this trigger here? It's a sound random controller, and we're going to call it SCR, short for sound random controller, because that's easy to understand. So we have here our curly brackets. Now, in here, if whatever is in the sound random controller, SRC, is not equal to null, that means that we can now say SRC dot play sound clip like this. And place, by calling this, that means that whatever current object is in our sound random controller, which is this whole thing, it will try to call the function that we named play sound clip, which is just here, which means that if we from outside of this code say sound random controller.trigger, and this will then this will happen. This if here means that it'll just check that if you have not added a sound random controller script to this whole thing, it will not play the sound clip. It will simply just return an error. So let's try and see here. If we go into Unity, we have our game object here, and press play, and we have no compiler errors. It plays the footsteps because those are over here. And as you can see when we're moving about, down here, it shows you which one it just played. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And if you jump, it plays jump, and it plays land when you land. The problem about having one audio source is that it only has one voice. So it can only play one of these at a time. So if I start jumping in the middle of a footstep, it will cut that one off. There are solutions to that, but right now we're just going to work with one audio source that can do it for us. So we have our game object here with our sound random controller on it. I'm just going to remove this one, remove component, and we're going to call this one here sound controllers. So we can have one game object with all our sound controllers, and we're going to call this one, we're going to call this our jump sound random controller. Now with it, before we put any sound into this, let's just make sure that it works. So here in our FPS controller, here, you can see, I've already typed it in before, using sound.random controller. And the reason why you just type that in is simply because now it knows it needs something from our namespace, which was called sound random controller. So down here, we are going to add a public sound random controller, and we're going to call it sound controller. You can call it whatever you want, but sound controller is fine. Good. This means that now in Unity, we will, when it's done compiling, we will get a public sound controller here. This means that we can drag and drop our object here with our sound controller script onto here. There you go. And let's try out some debugging here, because whenever he jumps, it will play the jump sound from our FPS controller. But if we, in our code here, say in our random controller, just for sport, we could type debug.log. Something was received. It'll send the line, something was received, to our console if something comes in over here. Now, here comes the interesting part. Well, all of it's interesting, but that means that we, in our FPS controller here, in the code of the FPS controller, can find where does he jump. And I think they have a play jump sound private void right there. Now, you see, it loads the audio source clip and plays the jump sound. But what if we typed sound random controller dot trigger, which should actually, it tells you that this is what you can type. Sound random controller dot trigger, and we are going to call this, what did we call it up here? We called it sound controller. Okay. Sound controller. Whoop. Ah, where did it go? Play jump sound. Let's find it again here. Sound controller, like this. This means that whenever the play jump sound is triggered in here in their code, it is up here. If the character is grounded and if he suddenly jumps, I have no idea how they trigger this or establish the fact that the character jumps. That's just their example, which is one of the things that I have found out on Unity projects all over the globe when I worked on them, that I can't read the code. It's much easier for me to just find, oh, okay, this is where they play their jump sound. Okay, I don't need to know how they do the jump or what they do. I just need to know where it's triggered. So anyway, play jump sound, it's triggered up here, and the void play jump sound is down here. It establishes the jump sound, and I have now typed in sound random controller.trigger and then the name of my controller. And in this case, we could actually rename it up here. Say this jump sound controller. Let's call it that instead, because we're going to do another one called public sound random controller footstep controller. Important. Let's go back to our play jump sound here. Jump sound controller. So that's the thing is that instead of explaining this to a coder and they need to randomize between sounds and they need to do all these things on every script. Let's say you do it on this character and then later you explain it that you want it on the NPCs as well and things like that. Maybe the programmer won't be so happy if you spam them with requests about doing this. So it's much easier now. You can just tell your programmer, I want a public sound random controller and I just need this one line of code put in whenever the jump occurs. The coder does not need to think about anything but that. And putting in one line of code without the coder having to think is way more achievable during a audio designer versus coder discussion. We have added these jump files here, and what you can see here, they're quite different, just for the sake of the purpose, not really for the sake of the story. Like, you know, that you'll be able to tell the difference really hard. Down here on the sound random controller, we have, actually we need five clips now. Let's see, 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 5. Actually, there are other funny ways to do this, because if the size is 0, you can just mark all of them and drag them all over there. It will automatically create a pool by the size of what you're dragging onto it, which is interesting. And a much faster way of dealing with this. So this here it's 2D, so we are certain that this will play and would be audible regardless of where we are. If we want this to be a 3D object, of course, then we need our sound jump controller to be connected to this game object here, or you need some slightly different code which will make sure that the emitter, the sound, the audio source follows it around, which is kind of different. But let's see here in Unity. So now we know that here's our jump sound. We should be able to tell now whenever we jump that it shifts between either one of these files whenever we jump. So let's try it out here. Jump 2, jump 5. It randomizes between them all because it does the randomization that we have told it to. Now, one last thing, and that is, let's say we're gonna move this out. This here, like I said, maybe we don't want retriggers. Maybe we do want it to retrigger. So let's here make a public bool called retrigger prevention. And we're gonna make it true to begin with, because we most likely will want this. So if retrigger prevention, yes, if retrigger prevention is true, then this happens. So only if our Boolean value up here in the inspector view, once it's finished compiling, faster, there you go, faster, retrigger prevention here. If this is true, then it will not move the file to 0. That's a bit of a problem in this case, because we do only randomize between the number 1 and the end of the array length. But we could say we want to only play between 1 and 0, but we will then ignore the 0 and so on. But that's deeper into this. But anyway, now we have a script here which allows us to have quite simply, whenever you need a programmer to understand what you need to do, you can now tell them this one line of code. You say you need up here, we need one public sound random controller. And if we can find our way back to it here, you give your coder this one line of code. Sound random controller dot trigger, and then the name of the trigger, and then it works. That means that now I can control whatever I want over here in my script over here. I don't need to do anything about the first person controller any longer. We can get rid of the audio source that is over there and so on. Way better. One last thing, and that is that we would like some sort of randomization here. So let's say we have a public float of pitch minimum. Can I spell minimum? Yes, I can. Equals 1F. And we have a public float pitch maximum equals 1F. This means that we now have two public floats, and they're both given the standard value of 1. The reason why we give them the standard value of 1 is because the pitch, if it's played back at 1, that is the normal playback speed. So what we're going to do is that we are going to find here that at the same time here, it will create a float called pitch. The reason why it's called pitch is that because it's just simple to use and we understand what it is. The pitch here is equal to the random range, random.range of pitch minimum comma pitch maximum. So now we have a value called pitch, and that's what it does. And sound emitter dot pitch equals pitch. I know it's a little confusing that it's called pitch and pitch, but this pitch here is the pitch of our sound emitter audio source, and this pitch here is the float that we named pitch. So every time it plays a sound clip, it will randomize between these two values. Let's try it out over here. It should down here give us two values, pitch minimum and pitch maximum. So let's try and play around with these. See, now we can jump. If we change this and then say we want it to be between 0.5 and 1.5, that means that every time we jump now, it'll over here in pitch, and the camera's moving while I'm moving the mouse. The pitch here should randomize between 0.5 and 1.5, which means half the speed and a 50% increase. It's not exactly the same, but we'll see. And that's useful because in this case, with the footsteps, it doesn't randomize the pitch. Could have been really cool if it would randomize between 0.9 and 1.1 just to give it a slight change. So let's see. And it randomizes between these values. It doesn't have to be such a hardcore thing. Now we changed these in play mode, so we should change these in while we're in edit mode, and then they will stay like that. The thing is that regardless of the code says that has a value of 1, but that's only as long as we haven't set a value different from that in the inspector. Now to sum this up, we created a tool right now which randomizes between sounds. It randomizes between the pitch, and it allows us to control retriggering so that we never have the same file to play. And we have made sure that now when we talk to programmers, we only need to give them one line of code that they can now call. Instead of having to explain that, say you have 3 different programmers working on 3 different areas. One is making a gun, the other one is making a character, and the other one is making a machine, that you want random triggering of sources. Maybe they do it in 3 different ways. Maybe they will make it public in various ways in the inspector so that you don't have the same. It's really important that code becomes easy to use and that you also establish an audio design environment for yourself that will make it easier to work like this. That's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this because this tool is super useful and I've used it quite a lot on a lot of projects that I worked on. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Hey, I almost forgot. I need to give a big shout out for the help with this code to Christian Schubert. I had some issues with it that I didn't quite understand, but that was mainly regarding to the namespace and the controllers and moving things about. He helped me really a lot with it. So virtual high fives to Christian Schubert for helping me out with this. Thank you.